Hello and welcome back to Angular 2 Masterclass with Alejandro Rangel. In this section we are going to talk about forms. Forms are very important and very complex because this is the entry point to get the user input data and then send it to our server. So if you imagine the registration process of a bank application or the login, the payment process, all these forms hold a logic to validate if the data that the user entry it's valid or not. And also it's important to show feedback to the user, maybe with red color message or something like this. And normally the logic behind forms is super complex. For those that have worked with Angular 1, I think we can agree that working with forms, it's kind of a nightmare. Yeah, and this is something that I think Angular team took carefully when designing Angular 2 forms. So in order to work with forms in Angular 2, you should learn the following concepts. First of all, local variables. We have mentioned this briefly, and remember that local variables are defined with the sharp. We will have a specific slide for this. We will need to learn also two-way data binding, so we can track the changes while the user is typing, for example, in an input text. And also we have to keep always the view updated with the latest value. So it's kind of a two-directional flow of data. Then we have to learn about ngForm. This is a directive that controls a form, and an ngControl, and this is the way to control or to handle and track the changes of a specific input in our form. So ngForm will handle many ngControls to understand if the form is valid or not. So let's dig into any of these topics. Okay, so two-way data binding. In the previous videos, we have seen that we can get the user data from events with the parentheses, right? So if you pay attention to the previous class, you will remember that to capture events from the DOM, you use the parentheses and attach this to an event. Also, we mentioned that we can do the binding of our model and display these values in a view, right? So if you combine these two concepts from the previous slides, then you have the two-way data binding. It's a little bit different from Angular 1. In Angular 1, there was a proper two-way data flow, okay? But in the case of Angular 1, it's just a combination of two different flows in the direction from the user input to the model and the model to the user input. But the data always go in one direction, and the combination makes the two direction. So Angular named this syntax the square brackets plus the parentheses in a funny way with the banana in the box name. So I will refer to the two-way data binding later on with this name, okay? So if you in the example that we can see here, we have an input of type text, and we are using the two-way data binding expression to keep the model, the property name, always updated in both directions. What do I mean with this? I mean that the model.name probably holds a value that comes from the constructor of a class or from whatever it is, from a service. But model.name will have a value, and when we initialize the input will show this predefined value. Once the user starts typing or deleting keys or characters, then the model.name will be always updated with the latest value. So this is what I meant when I'm talking about two-way data binding. And this is an awesome feature. Okay, so how does this work? Actually, the banana in the box, the two-way data binding with the square brackets and inside the parentheses, is just a shortcut to the real implementation that, as I mentioned before, is a combination of the square bracket and the parentheses in different parts of the input. So we can see that the real implementation should be: first, we have the binding of model.name to the ng model, and then we have the event ng model change, and when this happens, we take the event, this is what holds the value, and we put the event value in the model.name. So this is the real implementation, and the combination of these two makes the ng model with the banana in the box syntax. About local variables, this is a very powerful and is new concept from Angular 2. And when we define a local variable, basically we have access to the HTML input or the HTML element as it would be in a native HTML world. So we can access to the properties of this element. In the example, we can see that we are using a local variable. We put a name to this local variable. In this specific case is name input. And after that, in anywhere inside our templates, we can refer to this name input and then get attributes from the input type text. In this case, in the paragraph, we are getting the value from the name input. So this is a very, very powerful introduction in Angular 2 and local variables with the hash. Okay, finally, to understand the full concept of working with forms in Angular 2, we have ngForm and ngControl. These are two new directives for the framework, and ngForm it's in charge of keep tracking of the state of the form. So if we consult the value of ngForm, we can detect if the form is valid, is invalid, if it's dirty, and so on. ngControl, it's the equivalent, but for a specific input. So we can check if an input has been modified with the dirty property, if it's valid with the valid property, and so on. It's important to mention that I'm talking about directive, and probably at this point, if you are new in Angular in general, Angular 1 or Angular 2, you don't know so much what are directive, or you don't even know what it is, but you can think at this point that a directive is just a class that has certain logic related to a template or to a DOM. So then you can think, oh, but the components are kind of a directive. Yes, a component is a specific case of directive in Angular 2. So when we work with components, we were working implicitly with directive. Okay, so ngForm and ngControl are a specific directive attached to an input element or to a form element. So how can we use all this knowledge in our components? Here we have an example. You can see we are defining a local variable search form with ngForm. Okay, so what are we saying here? We are saying Angular, keep tracking of this form and all changes of this form, if it's valid or not, we want to access to them with the properties search form. Okay. Then we have an input, and for this input we are specifying ngControl. Okay, ngControl needs to receive a value. In this case is the search that comes from our model, and this is the way that we will tell Angular, okay, attach a control here that handles all the changes and validity of this input in particular. Then we have a local variable name input search, and we are specifying ngForm. This is, I think, in my opinion, this is the most confusing part of using forms, because you are assigning ngForm to an input search, and this is weird, right? But in the documentation, Angular explained that the framework is smart enough to know, okay, we are in an input, we know that the control in this case is search, and the model that we are tracking is model.search. So with this, Angular is going to take the ngForm, and this form will put inside the input search the search value of our model. So it's kind of confusing at the beginning, but it's just a way to connect everything, the ngForm with the ngControl, and the ngControl with the input search and the two-way data binding. Okay, so to recap this, the logic is like this. We have a local variable in our input, and it should hold the value of the model. Then we have an ngControl that tracks the changes of this model. And we have an ngForm that tracks the changes of all ngControl of the form. So this is a logic that we can check the validity of our forms in Angular 2.